My name is Dell Deaton, and I'm author-creator of the JamesBondWatches.com website and blog. I'm also serving as guest curator for the National Watch and Clock Museum special exhibit titled Bond Watches, James Bond Watches, to be held at the National Watch and Clock Museum in Columbia, Pennsylvania, opening June 17, 2010, and running through May of 2011. Following is a presentation I made to the annual convention of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors in Grand Rapids, Michigan, hosted by Chapter 101 on June 13, 2009. Where would James Bond be without his wristwatch? This is a research educational presentation, and we're going to be discussing the idea of how having a story or a collection thread makes collecting both fun and also helps focus and organize what it is that we're collecting as it relates to wristwatches. This story begins in 1952, cuts across brands, technology, and means of entertainment. Like the Motion Picture Association of America, I've rated this presentation PG. James Bond content and some of the things that are mentioned here may not be suitable for children. I respect others' copyrights, and I expect that others respect my copyrights. So, no video clips or screen captures from any 007 film will be shown in this presentation. That being said, I do expect that there will be things shown and shared here that won't be seen anywhere else. First question then, how does the public define a James Bond watch? In premise, I believe that it begins with who you are. If you're somebody in your 60s, it's likely to be the James Bond watch of Sean Connery, the Rolex Submariner. Late 40s, perhaps it's a Seiko LCD Digital worn by Roger Moore. If you're somebody in your 30s, you might not associate any particular watch with James Bond, thinking about Timothy Dalton's era. If you're in the younger set, it could be the Omega Seamaster, either the blue on blue worn by Pierce Brosnan or more recently the black on black Planet Oceans worn by Daniel Craig. If you're first and foremost a James Bond film fan, it might be gadgets that define the watches. The image here at left is a close-up of the dial of a watch model similar to that featured in Thunderball in 1965. There was a production department modified housing provided for this to make it appear to be a Geiger counter watch for finding out if there were bombs on the Disco Volante. I also mentioned in the second bullet point here the Buzzsaw watch featured in Live and Let Die worn by Roger Moore. Sort of an interesting thing about that watch is that it survived after production. It was sold at auction at Christie's in 2001 and realized a price of $37,000. The original Sid Kane production drawing, which was used to concept the watch, was estimated at that auction to sell for between $800 and $1,200. The realized price was $10,244, again, just for the drawing. And then the final point that I make here is that it's anyone's guess what Pierce Brosnan might have worn in his Omega Seamaster as James Bond by way of gadgets. I think that's personally, for me, one of the things that made his movies really enjoyable. Before getting to the good stuff, I want to respond to a couple of complaints. I think these fall into two key categories. The first one is product placements, that they are excessive in the James Bond films, and that the second one is that the gadgets, that we need to get back to pure James Bond, and pure James Bond is not a gadget user. And I think in both of these cases what people often argue is that if we would simply go back to the original Fleming, that would cure both of these problems. So let's take a look at this, beginning with brands and product placements. At my presentation in Grand Rapids, I asked for a show of hands of people in the audience based on what type of watch they'd actually worn to this public event. Hamilton Pulsar, the actual image that's shown there at the left, is a model similar to that worn in Live and Let Die that introduced Roger Moore as James Bond. No hands went up for that, not surprising. I did have a few takers for Omega Divers watches. Also had a few takers for people wearing Rolex Perpetual watches to the presentation. The final category, I had a lot of hands go up for this, but also I guess I would say some raised eyebrows when I asked if anyone was wearing anything fairly cheap. The thing that's important to note here is that on June 5th, 1958, Ian Fleming himself actually defined the James Bond watch generically as a fairly cheap, expendable timekeeper. The background on this is a fan by the name of B.W. Gooden wrote to Mr. Fleming. This was in the summer of 1958, just after the novel Dr. No had been published. There was a sequence described in there where James Bond was doing battle with one of Dr. No's henchmen in a swamp. A fight ensued. James Bond prevailed. Later on, James Bond looks to check his watch and finds out his watch is not working. The fan found this to be an unforgivable oversight on James Bond's part to be obtaining or using substandard equipment, recommended an Oyster Perpetual, actually a Rolex watch, and Mr. Fleming responded by saying no, that was not the kind of watch that James Bond would use. Went on to say that James Bond actually had the capability of, if he was not wearing a watch, to tell the time by the movements of the sun and the moon in all time zones. The final slide for this section then may seem a little surprising. There was a Saturday Night Live skit done several years back starring Steve Martin. He parodied James Bond on vacation without an expense report. What would that be like? James Bond would be gambling with 50-cent poker chips, and he would be bellying up to the free buffet, and he would be buying his beers generically as opposed to the top dollar brand that he's used to when he's on the Queen's expense report. Turns out this isn't so terribly far-fetched. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the novel that was published in 1963, Ian Fleming describes an actual use of James Bond's watch as a knuckle duster 5 years after the Gooden letter. He used that information, he used that idea, and describes the watch being destroyed. Bond is then later meeting with his boss and thinking in his mind he wants to look at his wrist to see the time. Notice that he's not wearing a wristwatch, and thinks to himself, certainly the destroyed wristwatch would be allowed on his expense report. So a very conscious, very money-sensitive James Bond. That concludes Section 1. Please continue to Section 2.